And just to start off, I want to draw your attention to the flyer on your chair. It's about tonight's event on the back for future events. So please take a look at that. There's also a note card if you want to write your questions. We would ask that you turn off your cell phones for the duration. And then from there, I'd like to introduce President Daniel Allen, the president of Salle University, and our host tonight.
Well, thank you, Mark. Can everybody hear me without this microphone before I enable, in order to introduce our speaker? So, welcome. We are in the university's really brilliant Museum of Art, and it's such a pleasure to be able to host you in this space. For those of you who haven't seen it, make sure you take some time after the lecture to walk around. Really a brilliant space that we are so proud of, and to be able to host, as Mark was saying, the second installment of the John Henry Newman Lecture Series. As many of you likely know, St. John Henry Newman was an English philosopher, theologian, poet, historian, and writer, and a great advocate of the liberal arts. Newman was known to have said that the role of a university is to educate the intellect to reason well in all matters and to reach towards the truth and grasp it. And as such, it's important that as a Lasallian university, we prepare students for the challenges and complexities of living in a diverse democracy and a global society. It's also important that we provide our students and the LaSalle community with opportunities to think critically and engage in civil dialogue with one another. And so it's in this context that I welcome Joseph Fornieri, the professor of political science at the Rochester Institute of Technology, to deliver this second installment of the John Henry Newman Lecture Series. Professor Fornieri is an expert on the political thought and the statesmanship of Abraham Lincoln, and the author and editor of numerous articles and 4 books on our 16th president. Tonight, Professor Fornieri will explore the thought of 2 prominent thinkers, politicians, and statespeople, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And through his talk, he will explore how Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln engaged in the Constitution and slavery and considered it as covenant with death or a glorious freedom document. These 2 men shared similar views on ending slavery and navigated a complex journey to reconcile the promises of equality for all. Mm-hmm. So before I ask Professor Fornieri to give his address, I would be remiss if I were not to thank the Office of the Provost and the College of Arts and Sciences for helping to make this evening possible. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Fornieri.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. What a pleasure to be here on campus. What a beautiful campus right here in the middle of Philadelphia. And I was just stunned by this art gallery as well, and everyone's hospitality. I want to thank President Dan Allen. I want to thank the Provost Shavante Amandon. The curator, Carolyn Green. What a lovely job here. I want to thank a new friend I made, Lucia Kagan. Mille grazie. Okay, danke. And of course, we can't forget Mark Thomas, who was instrumental, I think, in arranging the series. I'm very grateful. Of course, aside from the Phillies and cheesesteak sandwiches, Philadelphia is famous for the Constitution, the Declaration, right? This here is the cradle of the Constitution, and we We famously remember Benjamin Franklin's remarks at the end of the Constitutional Convention when he was asked by one of George Washington's friends, so what form of government have you given us? And his reply was, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And here Franklin provides us with a cautionary tale of the types of virtues and qualities that are required to maintain a republican form of government. Habits of the head as well as habits of the heart. Franklin may be a bit troubled if we consider our attachment to the Constitution and our attachment to our republic. Rightfully so, we should think globally and act locally. But we also have perhaps a critical appreciation that is due, and a gratitude that is due to this Constitution as well. A recent Wall Street Journal poll this year showed a decline in the importance of American values, including patriotism, from 70% in 1998 to 18%. The importance of, this is, I think, relevant here at LaSalle, the importance of religion likewise declined. The only so-called value that grew in importance was money. I don't think we can keep a republic on that basis, or we should be quite concerned, but also probably not surprised. There have been many ideological and cynical interpretations of the Constitution that have explicitly sought to reframe our history. Perhaps the most recent was the 1619 project, in which the author proclaims boldly that our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written, and suggests that America's founding should be changed not to 1776 in Independence Hall, but to Virginia in 1619, the date in which the first slaves, actually they were indentured servants, were brought to the colonies. This pedagogy has been adopted by many school systems. It was more simply than an article. It provided lesson plans on how to reframe American history. In effect, that the founding was not conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, but conceived in servitude and dedicated to the proposition of white supremacy. Interestingly enough, the author of the 1619 project and many other critical race theorists conceive of the Constitution in the same light as Roger B. Taney, the author of the infamous Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. Of course, one of the most infamous statements was that the right to property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. I'd like to revisit really the debate in the 19th century over the question of slavery in the Constitution. And I want to consider the viewpoints of two anti-slavery giants, one African-American, an agitator, former slave, I have to say with some great pride, from my hometown, most of his life, Rochester, New York. The other, our 16th President, Abraham Lincoln. My talk will, without question, I try and help reclaim what I would call a thoughtful patriotism, one that's both critical yet appreciative in these documents, by following the guidance of these great anti-slavery giants, these expositors of the Constitution. And this is based on a chapter of my forthcoming book that I've been working on for some time, comparing the political and constitutional thought of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. So we raised the question that William Lloyd Garrison in the young Douglass noted early on, that the Constitution was a covenant with death, or was it, as Douglass later claimed, a glorious freedom document. So part of this presentation is going to take note of Douglass's evolving position and his own understanding of this, which is quite explicit. In order to really appreciate Douglass and Lincoln's position, we need to consider three different anti-slavery camps. Now there's more, and Philadelphia is very important as really a center of African-American abolitionism here, as well as Rochester, New York, right? We were on the map. But very important to appreciate Douglass and Lincoln's thought and the similarities and differences between them is to place them in this wider context. And first I want to talk about Garrisonian abolitionism. It was Garrison who, in his Liberator, coined this term that was borrowed from Isaiah, that the Constitution was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. He infamously would burn a copy of the Constitution on July 4th. Now, this was someone who was an abolitionist, remember. He thought that the Declaration of Independence meant what it said. All men, all human beings, namely, are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights, but that, he believed, was betrayed by the compromises made at the Constitutional Convention. Frederick Douglass begins as a Garrisonian abolitionist. He becomes a friend of Garrison. He travels with Garrison, but then dramatically breaks with him around 1851. And the break is both political and it becomes personal as well. Douglass embraced a different school of thought known as political abolitionism, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we could refer to Lincoln's position as that being an anti-slavery moderate. So all of these are anti-slavery positions, but there are important and interesting differences between them. Let's first begin with the ends of Lincoln's statesmanship, right? What someone just asked me today was funny. They saw I had one of my books, and this one had an index, and they said, well, Abraham Lincoln, he really wasn't really concerned about slavery. He wanted to preserve the Union. And I said, well, you know, that's not quite right, because for Lincoln and the Republican Party, preserving the Union meant preserving the principles for which it stood. And this was vividly conveyed in a letter that Lincoln wrote. We have it really as a memo, an unpublished memo that was discovered after Lincoln's death, where he talks about his vision of the Union, and he uses an analogy from Proverbs 25. The word fitly spoken is like an apple of gold framed by a picture of silver, okay? And this was, historians think, a letter that he intended to send to Alexander Stephens, who became the vice president of the Confederacy, who had voted against Georgia's secession. Lincoln had knew him when they were both Whigs in the House of Representatives, and Lincoln had thought that he may keep Alexander Stephens on board and prevent further secession movements from erupting, and even have hope that Stephens may persuade some of his colleagues to remain in the Union. Of course, that didn't happen, and Stephens became the vice president of the Confederacy. But that's the context of this fragment or this memo that was discovered. And Lincoln says the philosophical cause of the Union is the principle of liberty of all. And that principle of liberty is of freedom, of universal freedom for all. He underlines all. Was the apple of gold. This was written, we think, around January 1861. And he conveys the complementary relationship between the moral principles of the Declaration of Independence, the aspiration that all human beings are created equal, the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of inalienable rights to all people in the pursuit of happiness, protected by the constitutional safeguards of the Constitution of 1787. That there's a complementary relationship between these two documents, and further, that the Constitution incorporates the principles of the Declaration. So we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, when it speaks of liberty, when it speaks of we the people and popular sovereignty, that is a recognition and that the principles of the Declaration animate the Constitution. And really, the Union involves preserving both of these. This apple of gold, which is morally and philosophically prior, this is the touchstone, this is the moral compass, but also the safeguard, the Constitution, in which those principles can be realized lawfully within a constitutional context. Another way, another very revealing statement by Lincoln in 1854 is he spoke of the Declaration of Independence as the creed of the nation's ancient faith. And he used another biblical analogy that the Declaration of Independence was like the Ten Commandments, an American Decalogue. Douglass used a similar metaphor in What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And so Lincoln, we could see, not only saw the Declaration and the Independence in the Constitution in terms of an apple of gold protected by the picture of silver, but also in terms of a dual covenant, right? The Declaration and the Constitution that we are bound to as a people. If the African American is a man, this is 1854, my ancient faith, Lincoln argues, teaches me that all men are created equal and there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. Now, that we could say constitutes Lincoln's vision of the Union and the aspirations, the principles that guided his statesmanship. Legally, Lincoln was constrained by the Constitution in terms of realizing these principles. And Lincoln was part of what the historian James Oakes calls the federal consensus. Most all anti-slavery actors during the drama of the 19th century fell within this camp, aside from a few of the most radical abolitionists. What was that federal consensus? So when we look at the parameters of public opinion and what was actually possible in terms of dealing with slavery, where did most anti-slavery advocates fall? And what were the elements of it? Very important. If there's one thing I'd like you to take away from the speech in terms of interpreting the Constitution and slavery, the big picture, besides the apple and gold and the twin covenants: freedom, national, slavery, sectional, and sometimes it was said slavery, local. We need to revive this principle. Lincoln, Douglass, the abolitionists, the anti-slavery forces fought hard and hung their hat upon this. What does it mean? It means that slavery may be tolerated as a state institution in which the federal division of power places a firewall between the national, the federal government, certain domestic institutions of the state. It's even that way today in terms of education, right? The federal government can influence education through incentives, right? Through grants or withdrawing funding, but it can't directly interfere with education. Similar legal rule in terms of slavery at the time. But the country, in terms of acquiring new territory, in terms of the foreign slave trade, in terms of our national character and destiny, is dedicated to freedom national. Slavery is an exception to the rule of freedom. And the founders were very much, the founders and the anti-slavery movement was very influenced by this case in Britain, Somerset versus Sword, in 1772, which was decided by Lord Mansfield, in which a slave from the Empire was brought back to England, and Mansfield ruled that slavery can only be maintained through force. It's inconsistent with the moral law. It is an act of lawless violence and can only be maintained insofar as it is a local institution. And therefore, he ruled in favor of the slave, and that in part led to the abolition of slavery in England, okay? Not the empire. That didn't come the Caribbean till later. So that's a crucial element of it. There's three anti-slavery sources for the federal consensus: the text, the intent of the founders, and precedent. Most importantly here, a forgotten act, which, as well as freedom national, slavery local, I want you to remember, the Northwest Ordinance. This was ratified by not only the government under the Articles of Confederation, but the first Congress of the United States, signed by Washington, and it banned slavery in all territory at that time held by the United States, north of the Ohio River to the Great Lakes, and west to the Mississippi. So fortuitously, the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin all entered the Union as free states because of this legislation. And it established a very important precedent for freedom national, slavery local. Remember, slavery preceded the Constitutional Convention. It was an established institution for decades, right? In fact, one could even say, since 1619, over 100 years. 3, no federal right to property in a slave. This is not merely semantic, okay? Legally speaking and morally speaking, it has huge implications. Does the Constitution recognize a national right to property in a slave in the same way it would recognize, let's say, a right to due process? In the same way it would recognize, or the amendments would guarantee you immunity for the free exercise of religion. Now, if that's the case, if there was an explicit right to property in a slave, that would commit the national government, the federal government, to protecting and perpetuating it. It would violate the principle of freedom national, slavery sectional. Okay? So, a cordon of freedom. Right? Cordon is an armed guard. So the South, the institution of slavery should be encircled, it should be suffocated, it should die a peaceful death and be placed on a path of ultimate extinction. Restriction, containment, and suffocation, this actual word, we don't use it as much today. A cordon of freedom is used again and again in the literature. Now, that's in principle. What about dealing with the existing institution of slavery in the southern states? As we mentioned, it preceded the Constitutional Convention. It was an entrenched institution. How should the federal government approach slavery there? Well, there were limits under this federal consensus understanding. One is that the Constitution created a firewall between the national government and state slavery. The federal government was banned from interfering with it. So only the most radical abolitionists like Garrison, who called for immediate emancipation, uncompensated in the states, regardless of the Constitution, even called for the Constitution to be burned, defied this recognition. There was also a House resolution in the early republic which reiterated this. The federal government could not exceed its lawful boundaries in forcibly abolishing slavery in the states, okay, prior to an amendment. There were concessions to the existing institution, understandably. The most odious was the return of fugitives. Okay, and of course, Philadelphia was a hotbed of and a stop on the Underground Railroad, and very, very famous for helping slaves escape in the abolitionist movements that were here. So, but for the existing institution, the aim was gradual, compensated emancipation with the consent of the slave states and colonization. Now, there was some thought that this was actually possible. Remember that prior to the Revolution, that every state had slavery. And then after the Revolution, about half the states had abolished slavery in view of those, in recognition of those principles as being universal. Lincoln summarizes it this way in his understanding between the existing institution of slavery, which we are limited legally to touch with, although it's still wrong, and the extension, where we may restrict it, where we are authorized constitutionally to contain it, to prevent its cancerous spread, okay? And that namely in the territories, because they fall under federal jurisdiction. He says it better than I could. He refers to slavery as a cancer, and he says, slavery is hid away in the Constitution, is an afflicted man hides away a wen or a cancer. A wen is a deformity, a blight, which he dares not cut out at once lest he bleed to death, with the promise. The Declaration is still incorporated in the Constitution. It promises that the cutting may begin at the end of a given time. Less than this our fathers could not do, and now, or no more, they would not do. That's a little. So, likening slavery to a cancer leaves no doubt, in one's mind how Lincoln viewed the institution, and it can't be cut out once, because that would have led to the death of the body politic, using an analogy, before it had gained sufficient vitality. Nonetheless, there's the promise that this cancer has to be cut out, and of course the implicit assumption, if you don't cut out the cancer and it spreads, it's going to kill the body politic. It's going to tarnish the apple of gold and rot it, okay? Lincoln viewed the founders' understanding of slavery at the time as a matter of necessity, that it would have created, in their view, a greater evil to have forcibly abolished slavery, and then which would have led to the aborting of the Constitutional Convention, and the possibility that the southern states could have gone their own way and create a Caribbean slave empire. Let's not forget that the southern South had in its democratic conventions had supported the annexation of Cuba as a new slave state in 1856 and 1860. They were bent on extending it. So this is the argument of necessity. That we can only tolerate slavery insofar as a greater evil may result. But in principle it's wrong and it should be contained. He explains it in his response to Dred Scott like this, and students, we all have a right to ask critically, if all men were created equal, were they, what a disconnect between the Declaration of Independence and slavery, and then its growth, right, in the Deep South and in the southern states. Lincoln tries to account for the difference between principle and practice here, and he says, the founders meant to declare the right so that the enforcement might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. This is an aspiration. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labor for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. He says this in response to Dred Scott, June 26, 1857. Dred Scott was decided in March of that same year. Now, under the federal consensus, the government still had tools for dealing with the existing institution of slavery and the extension. One we mentioned was the cordon of freedom, okay? That is to contain it and hope that it slowly dies out and that the states may take initiative amongst themselves with the moral encouragement and incentives of the federal government to end it. And of course, that's what happened in New York. That's what happened in some of the other northern states. Now, this is very interesting. John Quincy Adams, an unsung hero, there he is right there, old sideburns, gets in a rancorous debate in the 1830s over the gag rule, that there were abolitionist petitions sent to the House, and Southern members went apoplectic, saying because the Constitution, because we've agreed that there's a firewall between the national government and the states, these are illicit. In addition, they're offensive. They're deeply offensive to Southern sensibilities. We can't tolerate free speech that is harmful. Not kidding. So Quincy Adams replied to this and sought to get around it. And what he did is he developed in his arguments here, in this debate, an idea of military emancipation, that in the event of a rebellion, if the South, because there were loud voices of course, nullification and secession at that time, that in the event that the South would succeed, or there was a massive rebellion, that they would forfeit any constitutional concessions to slavery, and therefore that would empower the federal government under the laws of war, the international laws of war, which were also incorporated into the Constitution, according to John Quincy Adams, to strike at the institution and to emancipate. As you know from your history, this is the path that was taken. And this was a path that Douglass knew fully well, and it was a path that he advocated and Lincoln finally embraced in 1863. Another path was the final path was an amendment. Of course, Lincoln embraces an amendment in 1865 as well. All right, so that's the federal consensus. Let's look at Garrison. There he is, Mr. Peabody there. The covenant with death and an agreement with hell. And students always get a little understandably perplexed about how Garrison could have advocated these seemingly contradictory positions. So don't get mad at me if it seems difficult, or I shouldn't even say difficult, contradictory. I'll try to explain it. Garrison believed that there could be no compromise with the Constitution, that any conscientious abolitionist could not swear an oath to the Constitution, because it was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. And he was an immediatist. You can imagine what that is. Immediate abolition of slavery, okay? And if that meant disunion, so be it. The free states should extricate themselves from the moral pollution and taint of the slave states, and God will do his, her, their, its work in redeeming the nation. All right. They were non-political. The Garrisonian abolitionists were opposed any participation in politics because politics was corrupt, given slavery. So that meant you couldn't vote for anti-slavery candidates. That was a no-no, even though we agree in principle, no voting. And you could not swear an allegiance. And you could not run for office. So if you can't vote, if you're pacifist, they abhorred, eschewed violence. The means to achieve abolitionism was moral suasion, moral persuasion. Now remember, Garrison is part of the Second Great Awakening and this religious movement that's sweeping, this reform movement that in many ways in the North linked women's rights, abolitionism, and temperance. Okay? These three things were very often linked, these reform movements, and they were led by religious leaders. And the South, if you read the literature, many of the Southerners look at this and say, these Yankees are unhinged. It's fanaticism. They want to give women's rights, they want to give up, they want to get rid of alcohol, and they want to free African Americans. This is unacceptable, okay? So Douglass begins his career as a Garrisonian abolitionist. And he initially calls the Constitution a foul and bloody conspiracy against the rights of 3 million of enslaved and brooted men. So when people quote Douglass, be careful what Douglass you're quoting. Is it Douglass pre-1851? There he sounds like Garrison. But as a result of his conversations with these men, this one, Gerrit Smith, another unsung hero from upstate New York in my neck of the woods, was one of the wealthiest men in the United States and an abolitionist. And he helped bankroll John Brown's raid. He became friends with Douglass. He helped support Douglass's magazine, and he was part of a anti-slavery faction known as the Political Abolitionists. Lysander Spooner was another one. Douglass changes his opinion, and Garrison's quite upset about it. He thinks Douglass sold out because Gerrit Smith was financially supporting the North Star. He got pretty nasty. So Douglass announces his change of opinion in 1851 in the North Star, which we know was his magazine, in the great city of Rochester, Rochester, New York. We have arrived at the firm conviction that the Constitution, construed in light of well-established rules of legal interpretation, might be made consistent with the noble purposes of its preamble, which incorporates the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and that hereafter we should insist, this is heavy, that it be wielded in behalf of emancipation. Now notice, Lincoln sees limits. There's a firewall. But Douglass believes that now the Constitution itself can be used as an abolitionist manifesto to emancipate the slaves. Okay? Very powerful, 1851. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about one of Douglass's greatest speeches, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, on July 5th, 1852. In Rochester, New York, in the beautiful Corinthian Hall, which is one of the most amazing antebellum architectural structures at the time and is now a parking lot. We messed that up. So Douglass, of course, in his prophetic voice, chastises his audience, and there's this tension between him as an outsider wanting to be part of this celebration and being in exile, much of the African American experience of being exiled from the bounty that was promised them. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. What to the American slave is the 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. Now this is part of Douglass, but Douglass is a genius for his rhetorical strategy of the rhetorical reversal. So this is part of it. And yet in the same speech, he praises the principles of the Declaration themselves. He says the principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, in whatever cost. So, not that our principles were false. It's the application of the principles were unjust. Okay? And then, at the end of the document, this is often overlooked. Okay? In that instrument, he speaks of the Constitution. Now remember, he changes his opinion in 1851. This is 1852, shortly afterwards. In that instrument I hold there is neither warrant, license, nor sanction of the hateful thing of slavery, but interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. So we go from covenant to hell to glorious liberty document. Okay? Was Douglass schizophrenic? No. Like many great people who are honest, he was capable of changing his opinion. He was capable of entering into dialogue with others, and disagreeing, and agreeing to disagree. So this is an important quote, which we'll use as a basis to consider Douglass's remaining thought. Read the preamble, consider its purposes. Is slavery among them? Is it at the gateway or is it in the temple? Anyone know what that refers to? Is it in the gateway, or is slavery in the gateway, or is it in the temple? It is in neither. While I do not intend to argue this question on the present occasion, let me ask if it not be somewhat singular that if the Constitution were intended to be by its framers and adopters a slaveholding instrument, that neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slavery can anywhere be found in it. The terms. What is meant by the temple and the gateway? It's a reference to Ezekiel. And Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, has a vision while he's in Babylon, in the Babylonian captivity, of the temple that will be restored after the Babylonians had taken the Jews captive. And he describes its dimensions, and he describes in vivid detail the gateway of the temple itself that will be reconstructed. He's prophesizing a return, a deliverance from exile. Of course, this means a lot to African Americans, to Douglass, this prophetic voice of deliverance, and the point being that when that temple is constructed, if we look at the dimensions of the Constitution, slavery was not part of it. Let's look at Douglass's argument. He says that here he doesn't have the time on the present occasion, but he delivers the promise, to discuss the Constitution as an anti-slavery document in Glasgow, Scotland on March 26, 1860. This is probably his fullest exposition. Why is Douglass in Glasgow? John Brown came to visit Douglass and stayed with Douglass in Rochester. Douglass's daughter took a liking to John Brown. John Brown then went, as we know, to the woods of Pennsylvania and to Maryland to plan the raid. Douglass is on the speaking circuit when someone slips him a message, thank God, that John Brown has been apprehended. Brown asked Douglass to join. Douglass did not think this would be a success. He saw the act as futile, although he admired John Brown, and so the federal authorities, agents, came after Douglass immediately after the raid when they discovered on John Brown's belongings some of Douglass's correspondence. And so Douglass flees to Canada, and from Canada he goes to Glasgow, and he's still fighting this battle, this intellectual battle, and he's arguing here against a Garrisonian abolitionist in Scotland. what is Douglas's argument? One is he distinguishes between, and this is important, I think, when we talk about slavery, when we consider it, the government and the Constitution and principle versus practice. Douglass is a textualist. He is Scalia on steroids, a literalist, the literal intent of the words. He does not consider precedent or history or even intent. Intent only insofar as it illuminates the text, okay? You don't go beyond the text. The rules of interpretation, he uses the common law rules of benign construction, and the ends and purposes of the preamble. All of these are part of Douglas's anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. I'm going to go through this here. One, the text. He looks at Article 1, Section 2, counting slaves towards representation. Term 3/5 of all other persons is used. You're familiar with this. Article 1, Section 9, it's a double negative, a prohibition on the ban on the foreign slave trade. He notes that it refers to the migration or importation of such purposes. Article 4, Section 2, no person held to service or labor. So he discusses Article 1, Section 8, calls for the suppression of insurrections. Douglass then, using John Quincy's interpretation, says that if it should turn out that slavery is a source of insurrection, that there is no security from the insurrection while slavery lasts, the Constitution would be best obeyed by putting an end to slavery. So he performs, if you will, a rhetorical jujitsu on the South, who argues that the insurrection clause empowers them to perpetuate slavery. He says there's no mention of slavery, but if there is an insurrection, you will lose your slaves instead, okay? We could go on in great detail here, but we don't have the time. He uses John Marshall's principle of benign construction and United States versus Fisher. And the benign construction is interesting because it said if there's a conflict between interpreting a clause of the Constitution that may advance a wicked or evil purpose as opposed to a benign purpose, common law interpretation is you always choose the benign purpose. Since slavery is nowhere mentioned in the Constitution, in fact, and slavery is wicked, we then can't infer that any of these clauses pertain to slavery. All right, that's his interpretation. The 3/5 clause, he says, even if we concede that it applied to slaves, and that's a big concession. Douglass doesn't want to concede it, but he will for the sake of argument. He says it places a disability on the South and refers to slaves as persons with the possibility that they will be given full citizenship. He says, let's concede that Article 1, Section 9 is a reference to the ban on the foreign slave trade. What that meant is the federal government could not ban the importation of slaves until 1808. In fact, it did by 1809. Jefferson approved the ban. Well, Douglass says, in fact, that's moot because the ban was approved, and that was an important anti-slavery deed. He then looks at the ends and purposes of the government in the preamble, right? We the people, popular sovereignty, in order for a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, secure the blessings of liberties. None of these have to do with slavery. And as our friend nicely, we had a nice conversation last night, I'm proud of you, over dinner. He's comparing and contrasting the old Constitution to the Confederate Constitution, which explicitly acknowledges a right to property in a slave. And I hope you'll include a little bit of footnote to Douglass in there. Well done. Okay, so what is the agreement, as we wrap this up, between Lincoln and Douglass here? The Constitution is anti-slavery in principle, and it incorporates the universal principles of the Declaration of Independence. There is no right, there is no federal right to property in a slave. Freedom national, slavery local. It can only be maintained as a system of lawless violence at the local level. The government cannot, slavery does not follow the flag. In fact, the government is morally obligated to restrict it and to contain it. And most importantly, the Union, preserving the Union is a firm basis of anti-slavery action and military emancipation, ultimate extinction. I'd be doing an injustice if I didn't speak of some of the areas of disagreement. When you read Douglass's works, right up until 1863, he had a great sense of humor. You gotta laugh. I mean, he lambastes Lincoln, but it's so funny. I encourage you to read it because his sense of humor comes through. One, he disagrees with the federal firewall. The Constitution is a glorious freedom document, authorizes the federal government as soon as it gets powers and numbers to attack slavery and abolish it, even without an amendment. He retains the element of immediatism in the Garrisonian abolitionism. No concession to the existing institution, especially the fugitive slave provision. And interestingly enough, he disregards the founders' intent outside the text. That could have helped him actually in some way, and here he differs with Lincoln. Lincoln interrogates the founders in his Cooper Union address and makes the case that in fact, if we discern their intent through both speech and deed, those that signed the Constitution, they were anti-slavery and were committed to its restriction. Douglass doesn't want to go outside the text itself, and because he knows that the intent could go either way. That for every argument you make in behalf of Madison speaking against slavery, someone may drop one for him in favor of it. That's how Douglass looked at this. Douglass does not want to admit precedent. That's a very problematic element of his interpretation, right? Because he would say precedent is wrong, right? So the court has made mistakes before. It's regarded certain things as precedent, and it was egregiously wrong, right? Plessy versus Ferguson. Why should we regard that as a precedent? Okay. He also disagreed with Lincoln over colonization. Lincoln, up until 1863, at least rhetorically argued that the best solution to dealing with the millions of freed African Americans was to propose colonization. That is voluntarily returning African Americans to Africa or colonizing them in the Caribbean. Douglass was incensed about this, and there was a profound element of disagreement between the men. Black citizenship and suffrage. Lincoln did not believe that the principles of the Declaration pointed so far as to immediately grant African Americans who were freed the right of citizenship and suffrage. Although I will say, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's Attorney General issued if you will, we would probably call it an executive order today, granting African Americans who were freed and who fought in the Union Army citizenship. Okay, freed African American citizenship. Very important step to black freedom. But Lincoln believed that prior to an amendment, this was still under the discretion of the states. The three meetings are very memorable, most remarkable in history. Douglass, on August 10th, 1863, comes to the White House. He complains to Lincoln about the reprisal against black soldiers, the inequality of pay for black soldiers in the Union Army. He asks Lincoln to retaliate against Southerners that had massacred black soldiers, and he comes across with a deeper respect for Lincoln. August 25th, Douglass is astounded and shocked when Lincoln summons him to the White House and explains to him that, and we have Douglass's vivid account of all these meetings, and Lincoln explains to him that he's likely to lose the election. Now, this is prior to the fall of Atlanta, which occurs late August, and about a week later, early September. And Lincoln's electoral fortunes were in the tank. There was a strong peace movement. There was dissatisfaction with Lincoln's broad executive power, the suspension of writ of habeas corpus, military tribunals, and it looked like the Democrats were going to win. So Lincoln summons Douglass and tells him that gather a band of African American scouts, go through the South and spread the word of the emancipation and encourage runaways. In effect, Lincoln had embraced by this point, 1864, John Brown's plan for an armed underground railroad. Remarkable, thinking that he's going to lose, and that the Emancipation Proclamation will be revoked. Okay? March 4th, Lincoln's second inaugural. Douglass goes to see Lincoln at the White House. That's a big no-no. At this time, you have an African American go to the White House. Guards try and remove him. A commotion is made. Lincoln's about, on average, almost a foot bigger than every other person. He sees the commotion. He comes over. He greets Douglass and says, "This is my friend Douglass, and I'd like to know what you thought of my speech, the second inaugural." And Douglass says, "Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort." And of course, Douglass will reflect on Lincoln and discuss both his praise and blame and criticisms that are fascinating. That's another chapter of the book after Lincoln's assassination. Let me conclude with Douglass's own words, his peroration in the Glasgow speech. I want to remember this. The constitutionality of slavery can be made out only by disregarding the plain and common sense reading of the Constitution, by discrediting and casting away as worthless the most beneficent rules of legal interpretation. Remember, I told you the benign interpretation. Okay, by ruling the African American outside these beneficent rules, by claiming everything for slavery, by denying everything for freedom, by assuming that the Constitution does not mean what it says and that it is saying what it does not mean, by disregarding the written Constitution and interpreting it in light of a secret understanding, and of course the kicker right here. It is in this mean, contemptible, and underhanded method that American Constitution is pressed into the service of slavery. So, in conclusion, notwithstanding the bold proclamation that our principles were false when they were written, we will not give the 1619 Project, nor Roger B. Taney, nor for that matter the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, the last word on the subject. We will not allow this to go down the memory hole. If we do, we will forget the toil of Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln in their profound interpretation of the Constitution as an anti-slavery document. So let us, as we wrestle with these complex problems and these difficulties in our age in which we still feel the legacy of slavery and its effects, let us look to Lincoln and Douglass as guides as part of the conversation and reclaim the anti-slavery Constitution as a glorious liberty document rather than a covenant with death. Thank you. I'm sure you folks have some questions. Do you guys agree with Douglas? You think he got it right?
I think so.
You do? What about precedent, though? What about that resolution that said, we agree that it meant this and we can't restrict it?
Precedents are overturned.
They are, so you like Douglas's, but you know, I didn't mention this, but I'm glad I'm mentioning it now. The fugitive slave provision is hard to get around. It doesn't mention the word slave or slavery. And in fact, the terms just and legally were initially included in the text and then deleted. And Madison says in his notes that these words justly and legally held to service were deleted because they did not wish to convey that slavery was just or legal in a moral sense. That would have helped Douglas's cause. Lincoln, of course, will invoke Madison's famous statement that they did not wish to admit that there could be property in a slave, and that's why they use the euphemism of persons held to labor or service. But still, it's hard to get around that clause. Does anybody know how Douglas interprets it? If states, notice that it also says under the laws thereof of the state. It makes it clear that it's a concession to the authority of the states that slaves have to be returned to their lawful owners. Of course, in 1850, the problem is this draconian law that's part of the Compromise of 1850 nationalizes slavery. And that's one of the conflicts, that because it really commits the federal government and federal agents and to taking an extremely active role in even forcing nearby citizens to act as posses in the capture of slaves. But does anybody know what do you think that was? Yes.
So I'm familiar.
What's a person held to labor or service? What do you think Douglas argued that it meant? Who's not a slave that could be held to labor or service for a period of time?
Indentured servants.
Yes, he argues that it's a reference to indentured servants.
One of the lone dissenters, I believe two dissenters, but I believe there was only one to issue an opinion, Justice Benjamin Curtis, in the Dred Scott case. He devoted the entire section to that clause.
Yes,
and
Curtis, yep.
He goes to that specific section, held to service or labor under the laws thereof.
Thereof, that's right.
Reinforces the precedent of Somerset, which is that slavery can only exist as a municipal institution.
That's right.
And under municipal.
And what big principle, what big idea do I want you to take away? Because I like being a teacher. Even if you disagree with me, what's the big idea? Somerset, freedom,
national,
slavery local. Let's capture that and have that as part of the conversation when we debate this question. Also, look, I mean it fully ironic. I don't want to whitewash history either. Douglas has a point, right? I mean, in terms of the early Douglas, that we can talk on paper that this is all wonderful, but the human toll, right? The human toll of what this cost. And why wasn't it stopped earlier, right? It spread. There's reasons for that, right? Greed. The cotton gin, right, was invented to actually, make toil easier, but the world demand for cotton was so ravenous that coupled with the cotton gin, it made it extremely productive and lucrative. And instead of withering, it exploded. The demand for cotton exploded. So, but nonetheless, I think that perhaps in the 1950s, we saw the Constitution and the founders through rose-colored glasses. And that was problematic, right? They're not plaster saints, they're human beings. But I think this day and age, there's a tendency to kind of view things in too cynical a manner, right? Where everything is despicable and motives are completely base, and the principle plays no role whatsoever in politics. I think that's as much of a distortion as the rosy-colored view. Principle and power, right? Human beings are both, you know. Yes?
I suppose I just struggle with this framing of the whole thing.
What framing?
Well, like I guess Douglas's argument is what I have issues with, because if the idea is we need to protect the Union, like, rather than immediate emancipation.
Douglas argues immediate.
Yes, so I suppose it's Lincoln then. But if the argument is that the Union is the ultimate way that we can get rid of slavery.
Good, yes.
Then it almost puts the current enslaved people as like acceptable collateral for the long-term goals. And I suppose that's where I have issues.
For Douglas?
Yeah.
No, they have to be freed. There's no collateral. They need to be freed immediately. I think he would say with Lincoln that waiting, you know, saying that your hands are tied, saying that the Constitution does not give me the power to do this, that I have to do it. You know, that Douglas may argue that that's the human toll for that is too high a cost. But of course, that, you know, it's questions about the rule of law and what the Constitution actually authorized. So Douglas, you know, absolutely, you know, his point was that immediatism, that instead of being outside, right? And this is Douglas's journey. Instead of being outside, is kind of an agitator, condemning the Constitution. Now Douglas moves towards what? He moves more towards an insider and pressures the government from within, as much more so, as someone that shares the core principles and even a similar constitutional understanding, to strike. And saying there's no constitutional objection. In fact, you guys haven't gone far enough. You're too tame. But keep in mind, Douglas was a very radical fringe with this interpretation. This is a small fringe. And you know, I was asked when I gave this talk in September, did Douglas believe this? I think he did, but it's also plausible that he could have made this argument as, again, I'll use the term, as a rhetorical jujitsu against the Southern pro-slavery and Dred Scott interpretation. I'm sorry, I spoke too much. Please, your question was great. Yeah.
I suppose I just have trouble working through it with my own mind, because I always took somewhat of the interpretation that, like, we have inalienable rights that are in the Constitution, they're written down, and we have McCullough versus Maryland, that's precedent that shows that the federal government has supremacy over state governments. And I'm just trying to balance that with the idea that slavery can exist as a local institution, but not... Great question, yes. That's part of the complexity of American government and our federal system, right? In the division of power, the Supremacy Clause does not abolish the authority of states within their sphere of operation. And that's a huge, you know, this goes back, for example, the 10th Amendment recognizes what's called reserved powers. And one of the examples I gave is education. And we're still fighting that tug of war today, right? In terms of immigration, in terms of sanctuary cities, in terms of marijuana, the legalization of marijuana, my gosh, in terms of abortion. There's still a conflict between state and federal authority. There is a federal law prohibiting the sale of marijuana, right? But the states have kind of, including my state, has took it under their own authority while within their police powers to regulate it. So that's, and you know what? And this, the hardest thing as a teacher, as a professor, to explain this to not only to American students, but to many foreign students. You know, federalism is complicated, but that's what it was. We did not have a system in which the federal government was empowered to that extent where it could legally attack slavery. Almost everyone
thought that that was impossible and wrong, aside from a few radicals? Great question. Hey guys, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for, listen, you missed the Phillies because of this. I hope it was worth it. Thank you. Good question.